Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are going somewhere pretty dark.
Yeah, really dark. We're heading straight into, well, a very specific kind of Cold War paranoia.
We're talking about a time when the fear wasn't about missile counts, but about the human mind itself. The fear that it could be hacked, rewritten.
Exactly. We are unpacking the CIA's relentless, institutionally backed hunt for the ultimate weapon. Not a bomb, but a person.
A person who could be reprogrammed.
Reprogrammed, commanded to kill, and then just have the memory wiped clean. This is the story of Project Artichoke.
Okay, let's set the stage here, because to really get Artichoke, you have to feel the atmosphere of the late 40s, early 50s. The sources we're using today really frame this with dread.
They do. The U.S. intelligence community was convinced they were facing what they called the mind control gap.
The mind control gap. That phrase says it all, doesn't it?
It really does. The fear wasn't just that the Soviets had more tanks or spies. The fear was that the USSR and Communist China had perfected some kind of superior brainwashing technology.
And this wasn't just some abstract theory they were kicking around in a basement in D.C.
No, not at all. This was triggered by things they were seeing, shocking things happening during the Korean War.
American POWs.
Right, American prisoners of war on camera confessing to war crimes that never happened, denouncing their own country with this really unnatural, zealous conviction. It was eerie.
So the CIA sees this, and what's their immediate takeaway?
Their interpretation was radical. They didn't see this as the result of, conventional torture.
Not just breaking a man.
No, this was something else. They saw evidence of a technique so advanced, it bypassed free will entirely. They thought the communists had achieved total control over the psyche.
So that fear that the enemy was already ahead of them, that's what drove the response.
It led to this immediate and, frankly, immoral shift in policy. The U.S. decided it had to enter the psychological arms race.
It's just amazing, though. If you're so terrified of brainwashing, why is your first instinct to start doing it yourself? Why not just focus on defense, on countermeasures?
Because in that Cold War mindset, I think the fear of losing was so much greater than the fear of becoming the thing you're fighting.
That's chilling thought.
The objective just shifted. It went from how do we stop them from breaking our agents to how do we master these same techniques for our own offensive use.
Which brings us to our mission today. We are doing a deep dive into Project Artichoke, and our main source material is, well, it's pretty incredible.
It is. We're talking about the infamous 18 cartons of files.
Documents that were supposed to be destroyed.
Completely. They were discovered by accident in 1977, and they had somehow escaped the big purge of files that CIA Director Richard Helms ordered a few years earlier. These papers lay it all bare.
So what was the core goal then? What did Artichoke, which started August 20, 1951, actually set out to do?
Its mandate was terrifyingly specific. It wasn't just about interrogation. It was about determining if it was possible to control an individual to the point that they would commit an act of assassination.
Against their will.
Against their conscious will, yes. And then, afterward, completely erase the memory of the act.
The real-life Manchurian candidate.
That was the goal. The perfect, untraceable, disposable agent.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, Artichoke really feels like the point of no return for the CIA, ethically speaking.
It's the inflection point. It's where defensive espionage, protecting secrets, protecting agents, it morphs into this aggressive institutional attempt to achieve absolute domination of another person's mind.
And it laid all the groundwork.
It paved the way, bureaucratically, methodologically, for the much larger, much more infamous program that would follow, MKUltra.
Okay, so let's dig into that genesis of fear a little more. Section 1. We have to stay in that headspace, that climate of the early Cold War.
Absolutely. Because the CIA truly believed that if loyal American soldiers, men trained to resist, could be reprogrammed, then their entire intelligence apparatus was worthless.
The human element, their most critical asset, was suddenly their biggest vulnerability.
Exactly. So the questions changed. It wasn't about morality anymore. It was about behavioral engineering. The questions became purely technical.
How do you shatter a mind?
And once it's shattered, can you rebuild it to follow your commands? That urgency, that sense of panic, it gave them all the justification they needed to just toss ethics right out the window.
But it wasn't a sudden leap, right? It started smaller.
Right. It began with these precursor programs. First, you had Project Chatter.
That was Navy back in 47.
Correct. And Chatter was pretty focused. It was all about finding a reliable truth serum for interrogations.
And isn't that where LSD first enters the picture?
It is. A fact that's often forgotten. Project Chatter conducted the first documented human tests of LSD in the United States. So that seed was planted very, very early on.
And then after Chatter comes the direct predecessor to Artichoke.
Project Bluebird, approved in 1950. And on paper, Bluebird was defensive. How do we protect our agents? How do we stop them from leaking information if they're captured?
But the files show that line between defense and offense just vanished almost immediately.
At warp speed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bluebird teams weren't just running drills at home. They were immediately flying overseas, taking part in real interrogations of real prisoners, using drug cocktails and hypnosis.
So the name change from Bluebird to Artichoke in August 51, that was more than just paperwork.
Oh, it was a declaration of intent. It was, as you said earlier, the bureaucratization of terror. What were once these scattered, ad hoc, morally questionable experiments suddenly became a structured, funded, high-level program with a clear, sinister mission.
And speaking of sinister origins, that takes us to Section 2. This dark inheritance. Artichoke wasn't born in an American vacuum. It had roots somewhere else.
Yes, and this is a critical and frankly repulsive part of the story. Artichoke was the direct intellectual heir to Nazi experimentation.
Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip. After World War II, the U.S. started actively recruiting German scientists, and they prioritized their knowledge, especially their data on human endurance, under extreme stress over their undeniable war crimes.
So we were basically looking at data from horrific human rights abuses and seeing it as actionable intelligence.
Pure amoral pragmatism. We treated the findings from places like Dachau not as a warning, but as a field report, a how-to guide to be refined.
And this meant bringing over some key figures.
Key and deeply compromised figures. We're talking about men like Dr. Walter Schreiber, who is the ex-Surgeon General of the Third Reich, and crucially for this story, Dr. Kurt Bloom.
Bloom's record was just monstrous. Experiments with bubonic plague, nerve agents, on prisoners.
Horrific. And he wasn't just hidden away in some quiet lab in the States. The sources confirm Bloom was directly integrated into Artichoke operations at a place called Camp King in Germany.
So he's there, applying the knowledge he gained in concentration camps to Soviet prisoners for the CIA.
It's a direct, undeniable line, connecting Nazi medical atrocities right to the CIA's operational field sites.
The documents from the American researchers, do they show any hesitation,
Yeah.
any moral reflection on this?
None. Zero. They meticulously studied the Nazi reports on using mescaline and barbiturates to break prisoners' wills. They weren't reading it as history. They were reading it as a technical manual.
That reframing is. That's the core of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so organizationally, how did Artichoke get its power?
Well, it started in 1951 under the Office of Scientific Intelligence, the OSI, which makes sense. It was research-focused at first.
But then a key change happened in 52.
A pivotal change. Operational responsibility, the power to actually do these things in the field, was moved to the Office of Inspection and Security, the INSO.
So it moved from the science guys to the security guys. Why is that so significant?
Because it signals the shift from what if to let's do it.
Yeah.
It's no longer about research on hostilities. It's now about the immediate offensive use of these techniques. It gave them the bureaucratic cover they needed.
It became the central hub for this kind of work.
For everything. The
Yeah.
Army, Navy, Air Force, FBI, they were all coordinating their psychological warfare efforts through Artichoke. It became this massive multi-agency push toward one single horrific goal.
And that goal brings us right to Section 3, the obsession. Because this wasn't just about truth serums anymore. This was about engineering a person.
Yes, the dark heart of the project, the operational obsession with creating the programmed assassin.
And we know this because of a specific document, a memo from January 1952.
A memo that survived the purge. It crystallized the profoundly immoral question they were trying to answer. It basically asked, and I'm paraphrasing here slightly, can we get control of an individual to the point that he will do our bidding against his own will?
Against his will.
And, this is the real kicker, and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation.
Wow, so they're not just asking, can we make someone talk? They're asking, can we override the most basic human instinct to live?
Precisely. The strategic goal was a disposable agent. Someone you could use for a suicide mission or a political assassination who would have zero memory of it, meaning zero risk to the agency. The agent becomes a biological weapon you can just activate and then discard.
And they tried to do it. This wasn't just a thought experiment. The files detail a specific plan from 1954.
An operational plan to test a hypnotic assassination. The detail is chilling. They had a subject picked out,
A foreign national?
a former agency asset who had stopped cooperating, so, convenient, expendable. They noted his vulnerabilities, specifically that he was a heavy drinker, and planned to exploit that.
So what was the protocol? How were they going to do it?
It was a 3-step plan. Step 1, induction. They'd secretly drug him at a party in a cocktail. Then, while he was impaired, they'd use hypnosis.
Step 2.
Programming. Implant a post-hypnotic suggestion to assassinate a specific prominent politician. The name is blacked out in the files. There was also a note about a simulated attempt on an American official with a handwritten simulated only next to it.
A tiny little nod to legality, just in case.
The only one. And then step 3, disposal.
Of course.
The document notes, just coldly, that after the attempt, the subject would be arrested and probably disposed of by his own government.
And the most disturbing part of that whole plan?
The analysis section. It states explicitly that whether the assassination succeeded or failed was of no great importance. The only thing that mattered was proving the control method worked.
The person was an instrument. The murder was just data.
The life was irrelevant. The technique was everything. Now, here's the key part. They concluded it was probably not feasible.
So they stopped. Did they hit a moral wall?
Not even close. The barriers they cited were purely logistical.
What do you mean?
They didn't have continuous physical custody of the subject. They could only get to him at these social events, which wasn't enough to reinforce the programming.
So the problem wasn't that it was monstrous, but that it was inconvenient.
Exactly. The report strongly implies that if HQ gave them an intensive course, a clear euphemism for locking him up, they were ready to go. They believed the technology was viable. The failure was operational, not ethical.
The willingness to do that. It leads us right into section 4, the actual methods, the tools they were using to try and achieve this.
To get that kind of control, they had to engineer absolute desperation. They turned physiology into a weapon.
Which brings us to the morphine studies. The forced induction of morphine dependence and subsequent forced withdrawal.
It's as cruel as it sounds. The mechanism is brutally simple. You addict someone against their will.
And then you become the only person who can stop their suffering.
You become God. The interrogator becomes the sole source of relief from this devastating physical and psychological agony, the muscle pains, the nausea, the anxiety. The subject would, theoretically, do or say anything for the next dose.
And a lot of this research happened at a place that was supposed to be a hospital.
The height of hypocrisy. The U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. It was officially a treatment center for narcotics addicts. Secretly, it was a CIA lab.
And this is where Dr. Harris Isbell comes in.
Yes. The documents show he was administering powerful drugs to prisoners there, essentially trading them the substances they were addicted to in exchange for their participation in these studies, perpetuating their addiction for science.
So why morphine? Why not something else?
This shows the cold calculation. They found that withdrawal from barbiturates was also effective, but it was medically risky. It could kill the subject.
And they needed the subject alive.
They needed them usable. Morphine withdrawal, while absolutely excruciating, was physically safer. It maximized the psychological suffering they needed to break resistance while keeping the subject physically intact for more experiments.
That's not medicine. That's managing an asset. Utilitarian torture.
It's a clinical calculus of pain, completely divorced from ethics. Alongside that, they were still chasing the perfect truth serum.
They were mixing cocktails, right? Depressants and stimulants together.
Right. The theory was you use a depressant like sodium pentothal to lower inhibition, and then a stimulant like benzodrine to keep them awake and talking.
A chemically induced state of just, non-stop rambling.
That was the hope. But it was a complete failure.
Why?
They got plenty of loquacity, as they called it, lots of talking, but the information was garbage. The subjects were so disoriented they'd mix fantasy with reality, or they'd just tell the interrogator whatever they thought he wanted to hear.
And this failure is what causes the big pivot in the program.
It's a crucial moment. They realize they can't reliably get the truth out, so they shift focus entirely to putting things in.
Imposing narratives, implanting commands, and, most importantly,
creating amnesia, covering their tracks.
Which leads right into Section 5 and the search for an agent that could just shatter the mind.
Exactly. If they couldn't find a chemical for honesty, they'd find one that would create a blank slate.
And that chemical was LSD-25.
LSD became the centerpiece. The agency believed it could create such profound confusion and anxiety that a person's psychological defenses would just crumble. They wouldn't be able to lie because they couldn't maintain a coherent thought.
And they tested this to the absolute extreme.
to a terrifying extreme. In one of the most chilling cases we have documented, a subject at the Lexington facility was kept under the influence of LSD for 77 consecutive days.
77 days. What was the purpose of that? That's not an interrogation.
No, that was purely seeing what would happen. It was a test of human tolerance. Could they induce permanent mental disintegration? Could they break the mind so completely that a new personality could be inserted?
They were trying to find the breaking point of sanity itself.
Yes, and this wasn't just limited to prisoners. Starting in 1952, the CIA began dosing its own agents and employees.
Without their knowledge.
Without their knowledge or consent. At parties, in meetings. They wanted to see how it worked in the real world. And the results were often severe psychotic breaks, terror for these unsuspecting victims.
It's the ultimate betrayal. And this is where hypnosis comes back in, right? The chemistry and the suggestion start to merge.
Right. Once the mind was disoriented by the drugs, hypnosis was seen as the key to installing the final command, or, more importantly, the amnesia.
Morse Allen, the project chief, was a big believer in this.
A huge proponent. For him, amnesia was the ultimate operational security. If your programmed killer gets caught, you can't have them revealing your methods.
And they were even researching ways to do it secretly.
They were obsessed with stealth. The files show research into inducing a hypnotic trance using things like the monotonous hum of a polygraph machine.
Yeah.
The subject wouldn't even know they were being hypnotized.
So what was the ultimate artichoke technique they were aiming for?
It was a combination platter. First, a drug to make the subject vulnerable. Second, hypnosis to implant a command. And third, a final hypnotic suggestion to erase the entire memory of the session. A clean slate, ready for activation.
The fact that they were testing this on so many different people in so many places, that takes us to Section 6. The geography of this was global.
Oh, this was not confined to a lab in Langley. Artichoke was everywhere, and they deliberately chose locations where they were beyond the reach of U.S. law.
Let's start with Camp King in Germany.
A critical nerve center. It was an old Luftwaffe interrogation site that the U.S. took over to process Soviet defectors and spies.
And this is where the Nazi connection becomes truly operational.
This is where Kurt Bloom is working alongside the CIA teams. The interrogators there, called the Rough Boys in some memos, using everything: drugs, shock, hypnosis.
And there's that horrifying note from the files associated with Camp King.
The note that says, disposal of the body is not a problem.
Which indicates, with no ambiguity, that terminal experiments were authorized.
Either implicitly or explicitly, it meant that if a prisoner died during an experiment, it would be covered up. No questions asked.
And it wasn't just Europe. They took this to Asia as well.
Yes. Artichoke teams were sent to Japan, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the orders were explicit. Conduct experiments on foreign nationals.
They specifically targeted North Korean and Chinese POWs.
Yes. And that dehumanizing language allowed them to test things they couldn't risk at home. Lethal dosages, experimental surgery, things deemed not viable domestically. They outsourced their worst impulses.
But they were also running operations right here in the U.S.
At the same time, the safe houses in New York and San Francisco,
Run by George Hunter White.
a narcotics agent on loan to the CIA, a real piece of work. He'd set these places up to look like brothels, secretly dose unsuspecting people with LSD, and then watch them through two-way mirrors.
This was the precursor to Operation Midnight Climax under MKUltra.
It started here, under Artichoke, using the anonymity of big cities to treat American citizens like lab rats.
And while all this is happening on the ground, there's a war going on inside the project itself.
A bureaucratic war, yes. A struggle over the future of mind control fought between two key figures. The project head, Morse Allen, and this rising, more radical scientist, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb.
And Allen was the pragmatist.
The old-school security guy. He saw drugs and hypnosis as tools to get information from spies in the field. He wanted results, now.
But Gottlieb had a different vision, a much bigger, more terrifying one.
Gottlieb was the radical. He believed that to truly control someone, you first had to completely destroy their mind. He called it the blast-away approach.
So it wasn't enough to just get them to talk.
No. Gottlieb advocated for massive doses of psychedelics, especially LSD, to literally dissolve the ego.
Yeah.
Create a total psychological void that you could then fill with a new personality or a simple command.
So Allen wanted to make men talk. Gottlieb wanted to remake men.
That's the perfect way to put it. And ultimately, Gottlieb's aggressive, chemical-based vision won out. It was seen as more promising, more total. And that tension led directly to the next phase.
Which brings us to Section 7, the bloody transition to MKUltra, a story tragically embodied by one man, Frank Olson.
Right. By 1953, the CIA leadership felt Artichoke had failed. It hadn't delivered the reliable magic weapon they wanted, so the answer wasn't to stop, it was to escalate.
And that escalation was MKUltra, approved in April 1953, with Gottlieb in charge.
And with massive funding. And a new strategy, outsourcing the research to dozens of universities, hospitals, prisons. It created this huge, diffuse network that was almost impossible to track.
And the scope expanded.
Dramatically. It went beyond just assassination and interrogation to things like societal behavior modification, biological weapons. It was a total descent into unchecked experimental science.
And the human cost of this is the Frank Olson case. Who was he?
Olson was a bacteriologist from Fort Detrick, a top Army research facility. He was collaborating closely with Gottlieb's team at the CIA. He was an insider.
But he traveled to Europe and saw things.
He visited Camp King. And the record suggests he witnessed the brutal reality of the Artichoke interrogations, the torture, the terminal experiments, and it broke him.
He developed a conscience.
A dangerous thing to have in that environment. He started expressing profound moral doubts. He became a liability, a security risk.
And then, in November of 1953, Gottlieb acts.
At a retreat in Maryland, Gottlieb secretly doses Olson and a few other scientists with LSD by putting it in a bottle of Cointreau. For Olson, it triggers a severe psychotic crisis.
Days later, he's dead.
He falls from the 13th floor of a hotel in New York City where he was supposedly being taken for psychiatric help. The CIA called it a suicide for decades.
That story fell apart.
It did. The family pushed, and a 1994 exhumation and forensic analysis found evidence of blunt force trauma to Olson's body that happened before the fall.
So he was likely knocked out or killed and then thrown out the window.
That's the prevailing theory. He knew too much about Artichoke, about potential bioweapon use in Korea. He was a threat that needed to be neutralized permanently. It showed that the program was willing to turn on its own.
A chilling example of the paranoia eating itself. Which brings us finally to Section 8 and how any of this ever came to light.
And it's just a bizarre accident, a bureaucratic slip-up.
In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms orders all the MKUltra and mind control files destroyed.
He wants to erase the whole thing, and most of it was incinerated. It should have all vanished.
Except
for a stroke of pure dumb luck. On August 15, 1977, someone finds 18 cardboard boxes in the Security Office archives.
And they had been misfiled.
Incorrectly filed under Project Artichoke. Because they weren't labeled MKUltra, they survived the purge.
And those 18 boxes were the smoking gun.
They were everything. The memos, the field reports, the assassination plan. It was the documentary proof that unmasked the agency's true intentions. It proved the rhetoric of national defense had been used to cover some truly monstrous ambitions.
So the real legacy of Artichoke, it's not that they failed to create the super soldier.
No, the legacy is the institutional normalization of psychological torture and non-consensual experimentation on anyone they deemed vulnerable. Prisoners, addicts, foreigners, even their own people.
It set a precedent that human beings were just components, biological assets to be manipulated for the state.
And once you cross that line, the one Artichoke crossed in 1951, the path to the much bigger abuses of MKUltra was inevitable.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this? Artichoke's hunt for the programmed killer failed. Technically, they couldn't guarantee the results, but it absolutely succeeded in creating a culture of institutional darkness.
Where ethics were just an inconvenience. The documents prove that the question, can we make someone commit murder against their will, was an active, funded, operational goal.
And here's the final thought for you to chew on. The fact that their failure was logistical, not moral. That tells you everything you need to know about what happens when national security is driven by absolute paranoia.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does. What technologies being developed right now under the same guise of security might be following a similar dark path, just waiting for a future filing error, a future document leak, to show us their true purpose?
Something to think about. Thank you for diving deep with us.
We'll see you next time.